So in the late summer of 1851, the United States government signed this piece of paper, and it guaranteed 50 years of peace and prosperity to about 10,000 Native Americans who were all gathered out on the Great Plains.
Right, which was, I mean, a massive, totally unprecedented diplomatic achievement for the time.
Totally. But then, less than a year later, you have these politicians sitting in a room, 2,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., and they quietly take out a pen. They literally cross out the number 50, and they just write 10.
Just a single pen
A
stroke.
single pen stroke. And it didn't just alter a legal document, right? It didn't just break a promise.
Yeah.
It essentially set the entire Great Plains on fire for a generation.
He did. And, it's the ultimate example of how historical tragedies aren't always born from, pure malice. Sometimes they were just born from mechanics.
Of the bureaucracy.
Exactly. You don't always need a treacherous villain in a smoke-filled room actively plotting to destroy a people. I mean, all you really need is a structural divide. A divide between the people making a promise on the ground and the distant bureaucracy that's actually responsible for funding that promise decades later.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is to unpack the structural machinery behind two of the most significant treaties in American history. We're going to be looking at a really fascinating stack of sources covering the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, which is often called the Horse Creek Treaty, and the 1867 Medicine Lodge Treaty.
And we should be totally clear with you right up front, we are not doing a courtroom melodrama today.
Right, no cartoon bad guys.
No. Think of this more like a public television-style historical look at how a massive governmental system functioned, or, in this specific case, how it completely malfunctioned.
Yeah, because when you look at the raw documentation, I mean, the actual treaty texts, the congressional records, the military reports from the time, this undeniable pattern emerges.
Yeah.
In both of these hugely important moments, the United States made two very distinct kinds of promises in the exact same documents.
Two kinds of promises, yeah. They made a promise to protect the incoming settlers, and they made a promise to protect the native tribes.
And the staggering takeaway here, is we're going to explore with you today, is that the promise to protect the settlers was, on balance, kept.
Mostly, yes.
But the promise to protect the tribes, meaning their recognized territory, their financial support, literally their food supply, that promise was reduced, or it was unenforced, or just outright defaulted on.
Which really brings us to the core tension of this entire analysis. I mean, how does a decentralized democracy actually make a binding promise?
Right.
Why does separating the diplomats who look you in the eye, separating them from the legislators who actually hold the purse strings, why does that create a situation where a 50-year commitment can just evaporate before the ink is even dry?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp the sheer scale of the failure here, you have to understand the scale of the initial promise.
You do.
So I want to take you to the late summer of 1851. We are near Fort Laramie, out in present-day Wyoming, specifically near the mouth of a waterway called Horse Creek.
Yeah.
And the logistics of this event are they're mind-bending to me.
Oh, absolutely.
So walk us through what the ground actually looked like here. Because, this wasn't just a few guys sitting around a campfire signing a paper.
Oh, no, not even close. You really have to picture a sprawling, temporary metropolis just materializing out of the prairie grass. We are talking about an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 native people gathering near Horse Creek.
12,000 people.
Yeah. And the U.S. government actually originally wanted to hold this at Fort Laramie itself. But they quickly realized the fort's grazing lands would be stripped completely bare in a matter of days.
Oh, because of the horses.
Right, by the sheer number of horses. So they had to move the whole council 30 miles downriver just to find enough grass and water to sustain a population that large.
That is wild. 10 to 12,000 people in 1851. And this is from how many different nations?
From a dozen different native nations, many of whom, were historic rivals. So you have the Lakota or Sioux, you have the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, the Crow, the Assiniboine, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara.
Wow.
It was a massive, multilingual, incredibly complex diplomatic summit. I mean, by most accounts in our historical sources, this was the greatest peacetime assembly of Plains peoples the United States would ever convene.
Just imagine the translation chains alone.
Oh, it was English to French, French to Lakota, Lakota to sign language.
And just the food requirements. You've got 10,000 people and probably, 30,000 horses?
Easily.
The smell of the campfires, the noise, the unbelievable tension of rival bands camped right within sight of each other. So who's actually running this logistical nightmare on the government side?
So the lead U.S. commissioners were Superintendent David D. Mitchell, who ran Indian Affairs out of St. Louis, and a man named Thomas Fitzpatrick.
Okay, Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, and Fitzpatrick is a really vital character here. He was the Indian agent for the Upper Platte and Arkansas region, but crucially, before he was a bureaucrat, he was a famous mountain man.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had been a fur trapper, a guide, a trailblazer.
Okay, so he isn't some guy who just stepped off a train from the East Coast wearing a pristine wool suit,
Yeah.
Totally bewildered by his surroundings.
Exactly.
He actually knows the landscape and the players.
And that changes the entire dynamic. He knew the geography intimately, he knew the leaders, and this is a crucial point if we want to make the absolute strongest case for the government's intentions in 1851.
Right, steel manning the government's position.
Right. We have to look at this without the cynicism of hindsight. The negotiators at Horse Creek, Mitchell and Fitzpatrick, they appear to have been acting in genuine good faith. They weren't sent there to execute some grand deception.
Well, and they had a very real crisis on their hands, right? I mean, the Oregon Trail.
The Oregon Trail. It was essentially a transcontinental highway cutting right through the heart of the Buffalo Ranges, and it was just exploding.
Because of the gold rush in California.
Exactly. Following the discovery of gold just a few years prior, the river of immigrants moving west had become a flood. We are talking about tens of thousands of settlers, wagons, and livestock pushing through this territory every single summer.
And they're just wrecking the local ecosystem.
Utterly wrecking it. They were bringing diseases like cholera, they were chopping down the scarce timber along the riverbeds for firewood, and their massive herds of oxen were devouring the prairie grass that the buffalo relied on.
Which obviously causes immense friction with the tribes who actually live there and rely on those buffaloes.
Okay, so Mitchell and Fitzpatrick are looking at a powder keg. Their mission is to prevent an all-out war that would shut down those migration routes. Yes. The goal of preventing bloodshed was incredibly urgent for the U.S. So they sit down with these tribal leaders to hammer out a grand bargain. And the 1851 treaty they produce is structured as a very clear, two-sided ledger.
Okay, let's break down that ledger.
On the United States side of the ledger, they are asking for a massive concession of sovereignty from the tribes.
What exactly are they asking the tribes to give up?
First and foremost, the tribes agree to allow safe passage for all travelers on the Oregon Trail. They also acknowledge the right of the United States government to build roads and establish military posts across their country.
Wow.
That is the settler-facing promise. It's basically, let our people pass and let us build the infrastructure to protect them.
Okay, so the tribes are giving up the right to control their own borders, effectively. They're allowing a foreign nation to build military forts in their literal backyard. That is a huge ask.
It's massive.
So what is the U.S. putting on their side of the ledger to make that trade worthwhile?
Well, the U.S. offers three major structural promises. First, they formally draw lines on a map. The treaty explicitly recognizes specific national territories for the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Crow, and others.
Okay.
It is the United States acknowledging, in writing, this land belongs to you and these are the legal borders.
Recognition of sovereignty. That's a big deal. What's the second piece?
The second piece is the financial anchor of the whole deal. Under Article 7 of the treaty, the United States promises to distribute $50,000 worth of goods and provisions every single year.
50 grand a year.
Yes. And the text specifies this will continue for the term of 50 years.
Let's pause on that because I want to make sure you, the listener, really picture this. When you say $50,000 in goods, we aren't talking about handing out stacks of greenbacks on the prairie.
No.
What does that actually look like in 1851?
We are talking about literal wagon trains of physical necessities. This meant annuities, annual deliveries of specific negotiated items, wagons loaded with flour, sugar, coffee, blankets, heavy canvas, brass kettles, agricultural tools.
All the stuff they need because the trail is destroying their resources.
Exactly. The idea was to compensate the tribes for the destruction of the buffalo grass and the timber caused by the immigrants.
And for 50 years, I mean, that is half a century of guaranteed economic support. That's a multi-generational promise. You are essentially telling a young warrior, your unborn grandchildren will be provided for by this treaty.
It was meant to be permanent structural security. And then we get to the third promise, and this is perhaps the most tragic clause in the entire document when you look at how history actually played out.
The protection clause.
And the United States explicitly bound itself to physically protect the tribes. The treaty states the government will protect them against the commission of all depredations by the people of the said United States.
Now, I want to make sure I understand that legal term. Depredations. That basically means trespassing, violence, theft, right?
Correct. It means crimes committed by U.S. citizens. The U.S. is legally saying, if you let our immigrants pass through your land peacefully, we take full responsibility for keeping our citizens in check. We will protect you from our own people.
So if the story stopped right there, with the ink drying on that parchment near Horse Creek, 1851 would probably go down as one of the most balanced, impressive diplomatic achievements of the era. I mean, the tribes get security and resources. The U.S. gets safe passage and roads.
It was a triumph of local, on-the-ground negotiation. But here is where the mechanics of the American constitutional system come into play and where the machinery just begins to completely malfunction.
Right.
Because a treaty is not law just because the commissioners and the chiefs sign it. That piece of paper has to travel back to Washington, D.C., where it must run a totally different gauntlet, the United States Senate.
And this is the concept I really want you to wrap your head around because it explains so much of the ensuing tragedy. Imagine a massive public works project today. Let's say a renowned structural engineer designs a suspension bridge, right?
Okay, the bridge.
The engineer calculates the exact stress loads, they study the wind patterns, and they determine that the bridge absolutely requires 2,000 tons of high-grade steel to be safe. They sign off on the blueprints, everyone applauds, and they hand it over to the city council for funding.
Right. And the city council, who, mind you, have zero engineering background and live hundreds of miles away, they look at the budget and say, well, 2,000 tons of steel is just too expensive. We're only going to pay for 400 tons. Just cross out the 2,000 on the blueprint and write 400.
Exactly.
And then they still open the bridge to traffic.
The bridge is doomed.
Yeah.
The architects who designed the structure to survive aren't the people buying the materials. And the people buying the materials aren't the ones who will die when the bridge collapses.
It's a perfect analogy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. How does the United States Senate actually justify doing this to the Fort Laramie Treaty?
Well, the Senate takes up the treaty in May of 1852. And you really have to understand the political climate of the time. The Congress of the 1850s is deeply fraught, highly sectional, and just chronically obsessed with keeping federal budgets tight.
Okay.
So they look at Article 7, the 50-year annuity, and they balk. They view it as an extravagant, unnecessary 50-year tax burden. So they simply exercise their ratification power to amend the text. They unilaterally slash the term from 50 years down to 10 years.
Wait, hold on. Legally, how is that even a thing? If I sit down and sign a 30-year mortgage with my bank, the bank's corporate board can't just cross out 30 and write 5 without bringing me back in the room to sign a totally new contract. It's a bilateral agreement.
Under international law, you are absolutely right. It requires consent. But the Senate's perspective was driven by their domestic constitutional power. They hold the advice and consent role, and they frequently amended treaties with foreign nations, too, sending them back to the foreign capitals for reapproval. But here, the logistical reality makes that process completely absurd.
Because the foreign capital in this case was a temporary prairie city of 10,000 people that had completely vanished.
Precisely. The massive council had long since dispersed. The tribes had scattered across hundreds of thousands of square miles for their seasonal buffalo hunts. You cannot just reconvene that summit.
No.
But the government needs this treaty to be technically legal. So they send agents back out onto the plains the following year to gather, quote, a cent for this massive reduction.
You just ride out and try to find people like, hey, I know you agreed to a half-century of food, but Washington changed it to 10 years. Please sign here.
Yeah, it was an incredibly uneven, fractured process.
Mm-hmm.
They did manage to track down some of the leaders and gather agreement from many of the bands. But historians actively debate the validity of this. I mean, how meaningfully could the signers have understood this fundamental financial change?
Yeah.
And more importantly, what choice did they have?
Right. Because by the summer of 1852, the immigrants are already rolling through their land.
Thousands of them.
The military posts are already being planned. The U.S. has already taken its half of the bargain. If a tribal leader refuses to sign the amended treaty, they don't get the Oregon Trail traffic magically removed. They just forfeit the 10 years of annuities. They had zero leverage.
It is an open question of informed consent. But whether you view it as a pragmatic, bureaucratic adjustment or a course of administrative fraud, The structural reality remains identical.
The result is the same.
The native signers at Horse Creek heard, debated, and agreed to 50 years of support. The American political system delivered 10. The financial foundation of the peace was gutted by 4/5 almost immediately.
Which is just devastating.
Yeah.
But what about the other major promise? The territorial lines. The U.S. promised to protect the tribes from the depredations of American citizens on their recognized lands. Surely the government, having saved all that money, can at least keep trespassers out, right?
That territorial promise holds up only until it is tested by the single strongest, most chaotic force on the American frontier.
Let me guess. Gold.
The discovery of gold. We move forward a few years to July 1858. A Georgia prospector named Green Russell is panning near Cherry Creek, right at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, and he strikes gold.
And let's check the map. According to the borders explicitly drawn and agreed to at Fort Laramie in 1851, whose land is Cherry Creek on.
It is squarely, indisputably, inside the territory recognized by the U.S. government as belonging to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho.
Okay, so the United States has a binding, ratified treaty obligation to protect the Cheyenne and Arapaho from U.S. citizens trespassing on this exact plot of land. What happens?
The Pikes Peak gold rush happens. Pikes Peak or bust. By 1858 and 1859, we are not talking about a trickle of solitary prospectors. It is an absolute tidal wave of humanity.
How many people?
An estimated 100,000 miners, merchants, and fortune seekers pour into eastern Colorado.
100,000.
Yeah. And to put the scale of this violation in perspective, the mining camp that eventually incorporates into the city of Denver is founded that very autumn. It is built directly on top of recognized Indian territory, completely ignoring the vehement protests of the native people who actually lived there.
100,000 people. I mean, that isn't trespassing, that's an invasion. Where's the United States Army? Where's the enforcement of Article 7?
Here is where the structural asymmetry becomes brutally plain. The Army was present on the plains, and they did enforce the treaty, but they only enforced the half that benefited the United States.
Wow.
They successfully garrisoned the forts and protected the emigrant road, guarding the white settlers moving west. But they completely failed to keep American citizens out of the gold fields that were guaranteed to the tribes.
Now, I want to be fair here and look at the logistics, like we promised we would. Could they have stopped it? We're talking about a relatively small frontier army, heavily stretched across a massive continent. Could 300 cavalrymen physically stop 100,000 gold-crazed miners from flooding the plains?
Realistically, probably not. Even if the War Department had possessed the absolute ironclad will to honor the treaty, the frontier army was too small, and the demographic pressure of settler expansion was just too massive. It was a human tsunami.
But the outcome for the Cheyenne and Arapaho is exactly the same, whether the government was malicious or just completely impotent.
The outcome is identical. One promise, the promise to the settlers, was enforced with military might. The other promise, the promise to the tribes, was completely overrun by civilian expansion. The machinery of the United States was fundamentally built to facilitate expansion, not to halt its own citizens to honor a piece of paper.
It's a devastating indictment. The bridge collapses exactly where you'd expect it to. But this structural failure, these administrative gaps, they don't just result in legal disputes over property lines. They trigger real, catastrophic violence.
Yeah.
Because when the diplomatic machinery fails to handle small disputes, the whole region just catches fire.
And there is no better or more tragic example of this than an event that took place just before the gold rush, actually, in August 1854. This is a sequence of events where a single, relatively trivial property dispute effectively sparked a generation of warfare.
Right, this is the story of the Mormon cow.
Mormon cow, yes.
Walk us through this, because it sounds absurd until you realize how systemic the failure was.
It is a textbook example of how quickly peace unravels when bureaucratic gaps meet extreme arrogance. It's August 1854, near Fort Laramie. A Mormon emigrant train is passing along the trail, and one of their cows, described in our sources as footsore, lagging behind, and possibly abandoned, it wanders off.
Okay.
It ends up near a massive Lakota camp. A visiting Minneconjou man in the camp sees the cow, kills it, and eats it.
Okay, so we have a property dispute. The cow gets eaten. But under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, there's supposed to be a legal mechanism for this, right? It's not the Wild West where everyone just starts shooting. There's a system in place.
Exactly. The treaty established specific machinery for this exact scenario. It was supposed to be handled diplomatically. The emigrant would report the loss to the Indian agent. The agent would then meet with the tribal leaders, negotiate restitution, and perhaps deduct the cost of the cow from the tribe's annual annuities.
You fill out a form, you dock the pay, everyone moves on.
It was meant to be a quiet administrative issue.
But that's not what happens.
No, because the Indian agent wasn't present at the fort that week.
Oh, so the one guy who knows the treaty protocol isn't even in the room.
Exactly. So the military gets involved. The commander of Fort Laramie delegates the issue to a young, wildly inexperienced West Point graduate named Second Lieutenant John Lawrence Grattan.
Uh-oh.
And our sources describe Grattan as openly contemptuous of the Native Americans, eager for a fight, and convinced that a show of overwhelming force was the only way to deal with them.
Which is the exact opposite of the diplomatic mandate of the treaty.
He completely bypasses the treaty's machinery. Grattan decides he is going to march out and personally arrest the Comanche man. He takes a detachment of about 30 soldiers. He brings along a totally drunken interpreter named Auguste, who was reportedly shouting insults at the Lakota the entire ride.
This is a disaster waiting to happen.
And crucially, Grattan brings 2 artillery pieces, 2 cannons.
Wait, he marches 30 guys and 2 cannons into a camp of several thousand people over a cow.
Over a cow. And the leader of this Lakota camp is a highly respected Brule man named Conquering Bear. And here is the bitter, awful irony of this moment. Conquering Bear had been specifically designated by the U.S. commissioners back in 1851 as a head chief. His explicit job assigned by the government was to handle treaty dealings.
So Conquering Bear is literally trying to follow the rules. He's the designated diplomat.
He tries desperately to negotiate. He meets with Grattan. He offers compensation for the cow, multiple horses, in fact, which are vastly more valuable than one footsore cow. He tries to use the diplomatic machinery. He refuses to hand over the Comanche man, pointing out that doing so violates their customs of hospitality. But he offers to pay for the crime heavily.
But Grattan isn't there to negotiate.
Grattan refuses the horses. He demands the man. The tension escalates rapidly. The drunken interpreter is making things worse, shouting insults. The Lakota warriors, seeing the cannons pointed directly at their camp, begin flanking the soldiers. And then the soldiers open fire.
Oh, man.
Conquering Bear, the diplomat who is trying to keep the peace, is mortally wounded by the first volley.
And what happens to Grattan and his 30 men?
In the immediate, desperate fighting that follows, Grattan and his entire detachment are wiped out by the Lakota warriors defending their camp.
Now, I want to pause on the terminology here for a second because how we talk about history matters, and our sources are very specific about this. If you look this up in older history books, it's often called the Grattan Massacre, right?
Yes. For over a century, popular histories and textbooks frequently use the term Grattan Massacre. But modern historians, and the neutral usage we are adopting based on the sources, increasingly prefer the term the Grattan Fight or the Grattan Affair.
And that distinction is really important, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because massacre completely changes the framing.
It is crucial for historical accuracy. The word massacre implies an unprovoked predatory aggression by the Lakota against helpless victims. But the historical fact is that Grattan's detachment was the party that aggressively entered the camp, refused generous diplomatic negotiation, pointed artillery at civilians, and opened fire first.
Right.
Calling it a fight or an affair acknowledges the reality of the military instigation. It doesn't smuggle in a verdict that blames the victims of the initial volley.
So what does this all mean for the big picture? A cow gets eaten, an arrogant lieutenant ignores the treaty protocol, a head chief is killed, 30 soldiers die. Where does this leave the Great Plains?
It leaves it in flames. The Grattan Fight is widely treated by historians as the opening spark of a generational conflict on the Northern Plains. It showed every Native leader exactly what happens when a paper treaty meets a frontier reality.
That the paper won't protect you.
A single reckless act by a low-ranking officer, combined with the structural absence of the Indian agent, can completely void the promises made by the President of the United States.
It's the ultimate failure of the machinery. The architects negotiate the paper, the Senate cuts the funding, the Army fails to stop the gold rush but uses cannons to enforce a property dispute over a cow. The local officers don't even bother to use the conflict resolution tools they agreed to. It's just a compounding, multi-level structural collapse.
And because this disconnected bureaucracy failed so catastrophically in the North, you would think the government would step back, analyze the mechanism, and, fix the flaws before attempting it again.
You would hope.
But instead, they essentially dust off their hands, move hundreds of miles south a few years later, and run the exact same broken play.
Which brings us to the second half of our deep dive. We are jumping forward 16 years past the American Civil War to 1867. The U.S. government is facing escalating warfare on the southern plains, largely driven by the expanding railroads. So they set up another massive council. This one is at Medicine Lodge Creek in Kansas.
This is the 1867 Medicine Lodge Treaty, and the atmosphere here is notably different than Horse Creek in 1851.
How so?
This isn't just a rugged frontier gathering, it is a massive media spectacle. The government sends out federal peace commissioners, and they are trailed by a large corps of Eastern newspaper reporters. The whole country is reading dispatches about this attempt to bring peace to the frontier.
So they are trying to do this very much in the public eye. Who is actually sitting at the table on the native side this time?
You have leaders representing the major powers of the Southern Plains. So the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Kiowa Apache, often referred to as the Plains Apache, the Southern Cheyenne, and the Southern Arapaho. And unlike many earlier treaties where Native perspectives were kind of lost to history, the tribal voices at Medicine Lodge are vital and well documented by those reporters. Our sources highlight two prominent figures in particular.
Let's talk about them. Setanta and 10 Bears.
Setanta was a tremendously prominent Kiowa orator and leader. He was known for fiercely defending the traditional roaming, buffalo hunting way of life. He argued passionately that confinement would mean the death of his people's culture.
And 10 Bears.
10 Bears was a highly respected Comanche leader. He is remembered specifically for his incredibly eloquent, poetic objections to the idea of being confined on a reservation.
Yeah, I've read some of the translated transcripts of 10 Bears speaking at these councils, and he says something to the effect of, "I was born upon the prairie where the wind blew free and there was nothing to break the light of the sun." Like, these leaders knew exactly what was at stake. They weren't naive. They articulated their resistance brilliantly.
They absolutely understood the gravity of the transition being forced upon them. But eventually, under immense demographic and military pressure, and facing the literal extinction of the buffalo herds, they do negotiate. And when you look at the terms of the Medicine Lodge treaties, they heavily rhyme with the terms of 1851.
The structural bargain is identical. The government's goal is to clear the board. They want to move the tribes out of the way of white settlement and the advancing transcontinental railroads. So the tribes agree to end raiding and accept relocation onto two specific reservations down in Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma.
And we should look at the scale of these reservations to understand the concession. They established roughly 2.9 million acres for the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache, and about 4.3 million acres for the Cheyenne and Arapaho.
Now, millions of acres sounds like a vast kingdom to a modern ear. But if you compare that to the entire southern plains where they had traditionally ranged and hunted for generations, it's a massive confinement. It's like trading an ocean for a swimming pool.
That's a good way to put it.
So what is the U.S. offering to make this acceptable? How do they convince these nomadic hunters to stay in the box?
The U.S. promises peace and protection, naturally, but practically they promise the infrastructure of an entirely new, sedentary life. They pledge to provide housing, farming assistance, agricultural tools, schools, and most critically, to the immediate survival of the people annual issues of food, clothing, and supplies. Rations.
So they're looking Setanta and 10 Bears in the eye and saying, if you give up your massive hunting grounds and move to these small reservations, you will not starve. We will feed you and supply you while you learn to farm.
Precisely. But there is one crucial clause that makes the Medicine Lodge Treaty unique, and it becomes the pivot point for everything that follows. The treaty explicitly preserved the right of the tribes to continue hunting buffalo south of the Arkansas River.
The exact phrasing in the source is fascinating. It promised they could hunt so long as the buffalo may range thereon in such numbers as to justify the chase.
It is a remarkable piece of legal phrasing. It basically acknowledges that the government's rations might not be enough, and that the tribes still needed the buffalo to survive. It was a vital concession to leaders like Setanta, basically saying, you can still hold on to a piece of your old life as long as the herds last.
But before we even get into how the government inevitably breaks these promises, we have to talk about how the treaty was ratified. Because the sources point out another massive structural red flag here, similar to the 1851 consent issue with the 10-year cut.
Right, this raises an important question regarding supermajorities. The terms of the Medicine Lodge treaties itself are commonly read to require approval by a supermajority, specifically 3/4 of all adult men from the tribes involved, in order to cede any portion of their reservation in the future.
Yeah.
And this broad democratic standard was arguably expected for the adoption of the treaty's massive lifestyle changes.
Meaning you can't just get a few chiefs into a tent, give them gifts, have them sign an X, and claim the whole nation agreed. You need broad democratic approval from the male population.
Yes. But several historical sources point out that this supermajority vote never actually occurred. The signatures of the prominent leadership were gathered. The Kiowa, Comanche, and Kiowa Apache signed on October 21st, 1867, and the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho signed a week later. But that broad population vote was not executed.
So from a strictly legal standpoint,
Yeah.
did it even bind the tribes in the form that the U.S. Congress claimed it did if the treaty's own requirement wasn't met?
It is heavily debated by historians and legal scholars to this day, but the bureaucracy in Washington proceeded as if it was ironclad law. The paperwork was filed, the treaty was ratified, and the tribes were expected to pack up and move to the reservations.
Okay, so let's look at the lived reality. The tribes are on the reservations in Indian Territory. They have made this agonizing choice to trade their freedom of movement for a U.S. guarantee of housing, farming help, and daily food rations. So what does this all mean in practice? What happens when the machinery is tested this time?
It means we get to watch the exact same budgetary machinery fail again, in the exact same way, with even more catastrophic human consequences. Between 1867 and 1874, the treaty is put to the test. And the failure, once again, happens in Washington, D.C. Congress simply does not fully appropriate the promised funds.
They just don't write the check.
They don't write the check. The federal peace commissioners who negotiated at Medicine Lodge made a solemn promise of daily rations. But the men in Congress, dealing with Reconstruction, economic panics, and a general disinterest in Indian affairs, they just refused to fully fund the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
And we have to talk about what that actually means on the ground. We aren't talking about a delayed Amazon package here. What happens on the reservation when Congress doesn't appropriate the money?
It means the ration system collapses, the food arrives short, or it is rancid, or it fails to arrive entirely. The Indian Ring, which was this network of corrupt contractors and political appointees, they skim whatever money is allocated.
So they're stealing the treaty money.
Oh, absolutely. Delivering spoiled beef and weevil-infested flour. The promised agricultural tools don't show up.
So the people are quite literally starving on the reservations. The food they were legally guaranteed in exchange for their land isn't showing up, or it's inedible.
And it's not just the failure of the rations, it's the total failure of the protection, just like with the gold rush in 1858. The U.S. government completely fails to restrain white intruders from entering tribal lands.
Let me guess, more prospectors.
Worse. You have whiskey sellers crossing into the reservations, causing incredible social havoc. You have organized horse thieves stealing the tribe's primary source of wealth.
And most fatally, you have the professional buffalo hunters.
The hidemen. By the early 1870s, tanneries in Europe and the East Coast had figured out how to turn buffalo hides into commercial leather, primarily for industrial machine belts.
Wow, for the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. This created a massive economic incentive. Commercial outfits moved onto the plains, equipped with heavy, long-range Sharps rifles.
And these guys aren't hunting for meat.
No, not at all.
They are systematically stripping the southern herds for hides and just leaving the meat to rot on the prairie.
They are wiping out the buffalo by the hundreds of thousands every year. And they are frequently encroaching directly onto the lands where the treaty guaranteed the tribes the right to hunt. And the United States government does largely nothing to stop them.
Nothing.
In fact, many military commanders quietly encouraged the slaughter, knowing that destroying the buffalo would force the tribes into submission.
I really want you to slow down and put yourself in this impossible situation for a moment. Imagine you are a leader of one of these nations. You made the most difficult choice in your people's history to sign a treaty. You traded your absolute freedom of movement for a legal guarantee of food and protection.
Right?
And now the food doesn't come. Your children are hungry. The government isn't stopping thieves from taking your horses. And commercial hunters are openly slaughtering the very animals you rely on for shelter and clothing right across the border. What do?
You do the only logical, legal thing you can do to keep your people alive. The tribal response was to look at the paper they signed at Medicine Lodge.
The hunting clause.
Yes. The treaty explicitly preserved their right to hunt buffalo south of the Arkansas River. So, facing starvation because of the government's default on rations, the warriors left the reservation to hunt the buffalo. They did exactly what the treaty legally allowed them to do.
They went to get food because the U.S. didn't provide it, and they used the legal loophole the U.S. wrote into the document.
Yeah.
So how does the U.S. government respond to them exercising their treaty right?
The systemic tragedy here is profound. When the hungry tribes left the reservation to hunt, the U.S. Army did not view it as a hunting expedition. They treated it as an act of war. They treated leaving the reservation as a hostile uprising.
They treated hunting for survival as a military rebellion.
Yes. This dynamic directly sparks the Red River War, which ran from June 1874 into the spring of 1875. The Army launches a massive, multi-pronged campaign designed to crush the Kiowa, Comanche, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho who were out on the plains.
And to tie it back to our core theme today, this war wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't just a random frontier skirmish.
No. As the historical reference works put it plainly, the conflict began because the federal government defaulted on its financial obligations. Hunger was used as leverage. The control of the ration line became the ultimate mechanism of control over the people.
Because if you control the food, you control the population.
Exactly. When the food stopped, the government forced a binary choice. Either stay on the reservation and starve, or leave to hunt and be treated as hostiles.
And the military reprisal followed only after the tribes acted to survive. The military is sent in to clean up the mess created by the budgetary failure of Congress. And the Red River War ends with the Southern Plains nations militarily broken, their immense horse herds slaughtered in Palo Duro Canyon, and the people driven back onto the reservations for good, completely dependent on the very system that had just failed them.
It is a devastating sequence of events, and it is entirely structural. It wasn't one bad agent on the ground. It was the entire architecture of how the promises were made versus how they were funded and enforced.
So let's synthesize this. Let's draw the final dots together. Because when you set the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 side by side, the pattern isn't just similar. It's practically a carbon copy.
It really is. The sources outline a very clear four-part structure that is plainly seen in both eras, in the North and in the South.
Let's break down the mechanics of the failure. Walk us through step one.
Step 1. Annuities cut or undelivered by Congress. In 1851, the Senate slashed the 50-year financial promise down to 10 years after the fact. In 1867, Congress simply failed to appropriate the money, and the ration system collapsed into starvation and corruption. In both cases, the financial heart of the treaty was broken by the legislature, thousands of miles away from the negotiating table.
The architects built the bridge, and the politicians refused to buy this deal.
Exactly.
Okay, step 2.
Step 2. Boundaries unenforced against settlers. At Fort Laramie, the Army guarded the immigrant road but allowed 100,000 miners in the Pikes Peak Gold Rush to overrun recognized Cheyenne and Arapaho land. At Medicine Lodge, the Army failed to stop the whiskey sellers, horse thieves, and commercial buffalo hunters from ravaging the southern herds and tribal lands. The promise to protect the tribes from U.S. citizens was hollow.
Right, and step 3.
Step 3. Hunger used as leverage. This is most stark on the southern plains. The treaty confined them to reservations with the promise of food. When the food stopped, starvation became a mechanism of control. The choice to rebel was effectively forced upon them by biology.
You literally have to eat. And finally, step 4.
Step 4. Military reprisal arriving after the treaty had already been hollowed out by administrative failure. We see this with the Grattan fight in the north, where a trivial dispute over a cow escalated into artillery fire because an officer ignored treaty protocols. And we see it with the Red River War in the south, where the Army campaigned against tribes who had left the reservation simply to hunt for the food the government had failed to provide.
The military arrives to punish the reaction to the broken promise. It's a closed loop of systemic failure.
It is. And it brings us right back to the core asymmetry we started with today. In both 1851 and 1867, the United States made two kinds of promises in the exact same documents. The promise that protected settlers and travelers, the safe passage on the Oregon Trail, the clearing of land for transcontinental railroads, was, on balance, kept and enforced with federal resources.
But the promise that protected the tribes, their recognized territory, their annuities, their daily bread, that promise was reduced by the Senate, unenforced by the military, or defaulted on by Congress.
It wasn't one cartoon villain plotting in a smoke-filled room. It was the machinery of the state. The American system separated the making of a promise from the keeping of it. The executive branch negotiated, the legislative branch funded, and the military enforced. And that separation of powers is exactly what broke the treaties.
Which leaves you with a really provocative thought to chew on. When we look at modern institutions today, whether it's an international climate accord, a global trade deal, or a long-term infrastructure promise, we still tend to trust the earnest faces negotiating at the table. We look at the diplomats shaking hands, we see the photos, and we believe the deal is done. But if the ultimate fate of a treaty lies not with the people who sign it, but with a distant, distracted, constantly changing legislature that holds the purse strings years later, can any decentralized government truly make a promise that lasts 50 years?
It's the exact same structural vulnerability centuries later. The mechanics haven't changed.
Think about that the next time you see a historic agreement being signed on the news. I want to thank you for taking this deep dive into the source material with us today. Until next time.